What happens when one of Hollywood's biggest stars sits down for what should be a simple morning interview, only to face questions that cross every line imaginable? Mark Wahlberg walked off the set of the Today Show, and what led to that moment is more shocking than you could imagine. Before we get into exactly what was said that made a seasoned actor and producer lose his composure on live television, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me if you think celebrities should ever walk out of interviews, or if they should just push through no matter what. The morning started like any other on the Today Show. Mark Wahlberg was scheduled for a standard promotional interview, the kind he had done hundreds of times before. The segment was supposed to focus on his latest film project, a dramatic thriller that had him taking on a role unlike anything he had done in years. The producers had promised a straightforward conversation, nothing controversial, nothing off limits that hadn't been agreed upon beforehand. Mark walked onto the set with his usual confidence, greeting the crew and shaking hands with the host, Sarah Mitchell, a veteran interviewer known for her polished delivery and professional demeanor. The cameras started rolling, and Sarah opened with her bright television smile. "Good morning, Mark. Thank you so much for being here with us today." "Good morning. Happy to be here," Mark replied, settling into the chair across from her. "So, let's talk about this new film. You're playing a character that really pushes you into some dark territory. What drew you to this role?" Mark leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together. "You know, I've been in this industry for over 3 decades now. I'm always looking for characters that challenge me, characters that make me uncomfortable in the best way possible. This role. This guy is dealing with loss, with guilt, with trying to find redemption when he doesn't think he deserves it. That's the kind of story that resonates with me at this point in my career." Sarah nodded, glancing down at her notes. "That's fascinating. The film has been getting incredible early reviews. Critics are saying this might be some of your best work. How does that feel?" "It feels good," Mark said with a modest smile. "But honestly, I don't make movies for critics. I make them for audiences, for people who want to sit down and experience something real, something that makes them think or feel. If the critics like it too, that's a bonus, but it's never the goal." The conversation continued smoothly for another minute or two, covering the film's production, Mark's preparation for the role, and his thoughts on the direction modern cinema was heading. Everything was going exactly as planned. Then Sarah shifted in her seat, and there was a subtle change in her tone, something Mark noticed immediately but couldn't quite place. "Mark, I want to shift gears for just a moment, if that's okay," Sarah said, her smile remaining but her eyes taking on a more serious quality. "You've had this incredible career, but it hasn't been without controversy. I think a lot of our viewers remember some of the incidents from your past, your youth. Do you think about those incidents often? Do they weigh on you?" Mark's expression tightened slightly, but he maintained his composure. "Look, I've addressed this many times over the years. I made terrible mistakes when I was a kid, mistakes I deeply regret. I've worked hard to become a better person, to make amends where I could, and to use my platform to do good. That's all I can do. I can't change the past, but I can control who I am now and who I'm going to be moving forward." "Of course," Sarah said, nodding as if she understood completely. "But some people argue that you've benefited immensely from privilege, that you've been given opportunities to move past things that other people wouldn't be given. How do you respond to that criticism?" Mark took a breath, clearly choosing his words carefully. "I think everyone's path is different. I don't minimize what I did, and I don't make excuses for it. I served my time. I did the work on myself, and I've tried to be accountable. If people want to criticize me for that, that's their right. But I'm not going to apologize for trying to be better or for the work I've put in to get where I am." Sarah leaned back slightly, her pen tapping against her notepad. "Let's talk about your faith then. You're very open about being Catholic, about your religious beliefs. Yet you've played characters in films that glorify violence, that use explicit language, that promote values that seem contradictory to church teachings. How do you reconcile that? Isn't that hypocritical? Mark's jaw tensed visibly. That's a pretty reductive way to look at it. I'm an actor. I tell stories. Those stories aren't always about perfect people living perfect lives. They're about the human experience, which is messy and complicated. My faith is personal, and it guides how I live my life, how I treat people, how I raise my kids. But it doesn't mean I can only play saints and angels in movies. That's not how art works. But don't you think you have a responsibility, Sarah pressed, especially to young people who look up to you? When you star in films that depict graphic violence or criminal behavior, aren't you sending a message that those things are acceptable? Mark shook his head, his frustration starting to show. No, I completely disagree with that premise. Audiences aren't children. They can distinguish between fiction and reality. I've played cops, criminals, soldiers, fathers, addicts. None of those roles define who I am as a person. And frankly, this line of questioning feels less like an interview about my new film and more like you're trying to put me on trial for something. Sarah smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I'm just asking questions that I think a lot of people want answers to. Mark, you're a public figure. Surely you understand that comes with scrutiny. There's scrutiny, and then there's an agenda, Mark replied, his voice firm but controlled. And right now, it feels like you've got one. Asterisk, we agreed to talk about the film. That's why I'm here. I didn't come here to defend my entire life and career. Well, your life and career are connected to your work, aren't they? Sarah countered smoothly. I mean, you can't separate the artist from the art, right? That's something people say all the time now. Mark stared at her for a long moment, the tension between them thick enough to cut. Actually, I think you can, and I think you should. But clearly, we have very different ideas about what this interview was supposed to be. Sarah didn't miss a beat, pressing forward as if Mark hadn't just called out the direction of the interview. Speaking of separating things, let's talk about your business ventures. You've made a lot of money outside of acting. Restaurant chain, the production company, the fitness brand. Some critics say you're spreading yourself too thin. That you're more focused on building an empire than actually caring about the craft of acting anymore. Is there truth to that? Mark let out a short, incredulous laugh. Are you serious right now? So I'm supposed to just act and do nothing else? I can't be a businessman. I can't create opportunities for other people. I employ hundreds of people through those ventures. I've created jobs, supported communities, but yeah, let's frame that as a negative somehow. I'm not framing it as anything, Sarah said with practiced innocence. I'm simply presenting a perspective that exists and giving you a chance to address it. No, what you're doing is taking every single thing about me and twisting it into something questionable. Mark shot back. My past, my faith, my career choices, my business decisions. Everything is being framed as a problem. This isn't journalism. This is a hit piece disguised as an interview. Sarah's smile finally faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. Mark, understand you might be feeling defensive, but these are legitimate questions that people have. You're a public figure who's been in the spotlight for decades. Surely you expected to answer some challenging questions. Challenging questions about the film. Sure, Mark said, his voice rising slightly before he caught himself and brought it back down. Questions about my process, about the story we're telling, about the themes in the movie. But you haven't asked a single meaningful question about the actual project I'm here to promote. Instead, you've spent the last several minutes trying to tear me down. That's not my intention at all, Sarah insisted, though her body language suggested otherwise. Let me ask you this then. In this new film, your character is dealing with family trauma. You have 4 children of your own. How do you protect them from the darker aspects of Hollywood? There have been so many scandals involving child actors and exploitation in the industry. As a father, doesn't that terrify you? Mark paused, clearly weighing whether to engage with this line of questioning. Of course, it concerns me. Any parent in this industry has to be vigilant. But my kids are my kids. They're not props for this conversation. And honestly, the way you just pivoted from attacking me to bringing up my children that crosses a line. I'm not attacking anyone, Sarah said firmly. I'm having a conversation. If you're uncomfortable answering questions about how your career affects your family life, we can move on. You know what? Mark said, his patience visibly wearing thin. Maybe we should move on back to the film, the thing I actually came here to discuss. Sarah glanced at her notes again, and for a brief moment, it seemed like she might actually steer the interview back to safer ground. But then she looked up with another question that landed like a grenade. Mark, I'm trying to give you a platform to clear the air on these issues. If you're not willing to engage in honest conversation, then perhaps you're proving some of these critics right. Honest conversation, Mark repeated, shaking his head in disbelief. There's nothing honest about this. You've ambushed me with loaded questions, brought up my children, and now you're citing anonymous gossip as if it's credible information. And when I push back, you're trying to make it seem like I'm the problem. You are getting quite defensive, Sarah observed, her tone almost clinical now. That's usually a sign that there's some truth to what's being discussed. Or it's a sign that I'm being disrespected on live television, Mark countered, his voice sharp. I've done thousands of interviews in my career. I've answered tough questions. I've been held accountable for things I've done. But this what you're doing right now, this isn't holding me accountable. This is trying to create a moment, trying to get a reaction so you can have a viral clip. Sarah sat up straighter, her professional mask slipping just enough to show genuine irritation. I'm doing my job, Mark. If you can't handle being asked questions that aren't comfortable, maybe you need to reconsider doing interviews. My job is to make films and tell stories, Mark said, his voice deadly calm now. Your job is supposed to be informing the public and having meaningful conversations. But instead, you've turned this into an interrogation. So let me ask you a question, Sarah. What's your endgame here? What are you trying to accomplish? Because it sure isn't promoting my film or giving your viewers anything of value. I'm trying to present a full picture of who you are. Not just the sanitized version you want people to see, Sarah replied, not backing down. You've built this image of being a family man, a person of faith, someone who's overcome their past. But is that image real, or is it just good publicity? Mark stood up from his chair, and the studio went silent. You don't get to question my faith. You don't get to question my family. You don't know me. You don't know anything about my life beyond what you've read in articles or heard from people who have their own agendas. I came here in good faith to talk about a film I'm proud of. Film that my team worked incredibly hard on, and you've turned it into this circus. Mark, please sit down, Sarah said, though there was an edge of uncertainty in her voice. We still have time left in the segment. No, we don't. Mark said, pulling off the small microphone clipped to his shirt. I'm done. This interview is over. You're really going to walk out? Sarah asked, her eyes widening slightly on live television. Watch me, Mark said, dropping the microphone on the chair he had just vacated. He looked directly into the camera for a brief second, and viewers at home could see the mixture of anger and disappointment on his face. Then he turned and walked toward the edge of the set. Sarah recovered quickly, her training kicking in as she addressed the camera while Mark made his way off set. Well, that was certainly unexpected. We want to thank Mark Wahlberg for his time this morning, even though our conversation took an unfortunate turn. We'll be right back after this break. But Mark was already past the cameras, past the crew members who stood frozen with uncertain expressions, past the producers who were frantically trying to figure out what to do next. One of them, a younger woman with a headset and a clipboard, stepped into his path. "Mr. Wahlberg, please can we just talk for a moment?" Mark stopped, his jaw still set tight. "There's nothing to talk about. That was a setup from the beginning, and you all knew it. You told me this would be about the film. You promised me a fair interview. That wasn't fair. That was an ambush." The producer looked genuinely distressed. "I didn't know she was going to go in that direction. I swear the questions we discussed were completely different. I don't know what happened." "What happened is your host decided to make a name for herself at my expense," Mark said, his voice lower now but no less intense. "She wanted a moment, and she got one, just not the one she was hoping for." Another voice cut through the tension. "Mark, wait." It was Sarah, who had left the set and followed him. Her professional composure was still intact, but there was something desperate underneath it. "Can we talk about this off camera?" Mark turned to face her, his expression cold. "Now you want to talk off camera. That's interesting. You didn't seem too concerned about having a real conversation when we were on camera." "That interview was a disaster, and I take responsibility for how it went," Sarah said, though her tone suggested she didn't fully believe her own words. "But walking out like that, you made yourself look guilty, made it seem like you have something to hide." "No," Mark said firmly. "I made it clear that I won't be disrespected. There's a difference. You asked me about my past? Fine. You questioned my career choices. Okay. But when you started bringing up my kids, when you started throwing out anonymous accusations like they were facts, you crossed lines that shouldn't be crossed. And I'm not going to sit there and pretend that's acceptable just because there are cameras rolling." "You're a public figure," Sarah insisted. "This comes with the territory." "Being a public figure doesn't mean I forfeit my right to be treated with basic respect," Mark countered. "It doesn't mean I have to sit there while someone tries to tear me down under the guise of journalism. You weren't trying to inform anyone. You were trying to create drama. And yeah, you got your drama. But you also lost any credibility you might have had." Sarah's face flushed slightly. "I was asking questions that people want answered." "No, you were asking questions that you wanted me to answer in a way that would make me look bad." "No matter what I said," Mark replied. "That's not the same thing. Every question was designed to put me on the defensive, to make me look like I was hiding something or avoiding something. That's not an interview. That's a trap." "I think you're being overly sensitive," Sarah said, and immediately Mark could see she regretted the choice of words. "Overly sensitive," Mark repeated slowly. "That's your takeaway here, that I'm being overly sensitive because I called out your tactics. You know what, Sarah? This conversation is as pointless as that interview was. I'm leaving." He turned again, and this time Sarah didn't follow. The producer with the clipboard did, though, catching up to him as he reached the hallway leading to the exit. "Mr. Wahlberg, I am truly sorry about what happened in there. This isn't how we operate. I can promise you that." Mark stopped and looked at her, his expression softening slightly. "You seem sincere, so I appreciate that. But the damage is done. I came here to talk about a film that I cared deeply about, a project that means something to me, and instead, I got ambushed. That's not something I'm going to forget. Is there anything we can do to make this right?" The producer asked. "Hopefully you can make sure that other guests don't get treated the way I just was." Mark said, "You can hold your host accountable for what just happened instead of letting her spin this as me being difficult or unable to handle tough questions. Because that's what's going to happen, right? She's going to go on social media, go on other shows, and talk about how I walked out." She framed herself as the victim and me as the aggressor. That's how this works. The producer didn't deny it, which told Mark everything he needed to know. He gave her a slight nod and continued toward the exit. His mind was already racing through the fallout that would inevitably come. The headlines, the opinion pieces, the endless social media debates. Some people would support him for standing up for himself. Others would criticize him for being unable to handle criticism. The entertainment news cycle would churn on this for days, maybe even weeks. But as he pushed through the door and stepped out into the morning air, Mark felt something unexpected. Relief. He had spent decades playing the game, doing interviews, saying the right things, carefully managing his image. And in one moment, it simply said enough. He had drawn a line. Whether people understood it or agreed with it didn't matter as much as he thought it would. His phone was already buzzing. In his pocket, his publicist, undoubtedly. His manager, probably. Maybe even his wife checking if he was okay after seeing what happened on live television. He would deal with all of that later. He would release a statement if necessary, handle the damage control if required. But one thing he knew for certain, he wouldn't apologize for walking out. He wouldn't pretend that what happened in that studio was acceptable. The film would still come out. People would either watch it or they wouldn't. His career would continue. Or it wouldn't. But at least he could look at himself in the mirror and know that he didn't compromise his dignity for the sake of publicity. Sometimes that had to be enough. As he climbed into the car waiting for him, Mark allowed himself one last thought about the interview. Sarah Mitchell had wanted a moment that would define her career, something that would get people talking. She definitely got that moment, just not in the way she intended. Because while she tried to tear him down, she had inadvertently reminded him of something important. He didn't owe anyone access to his life. Beyond what he chose to give, he didn't have to sit through disrespect just because someone had a camera pointed at him. The car pulled away from the studio, and Mark finally allowed himself to relax. His phone kept buzzing, but he ignored it. For now,